Okay, let's keep you there, and let's start with editing. Because I know that we talked about extending social cost to sort of industrial organization, or having industrial organization insight into social cost. And then if anybody else also want to add on some extensions, we can talk about that.
I thought I'd actually say something a little bit different,
okay.
Actually, if that's okay. that wasn't a solid agreement, right? Well, I was thinking about it, and Sebastian and I have actually been speaking, have been having a conversation about social costs since we've been together over Dickinson, and I was reminded hearing all of the panelists who come to this subject from various perspectives, generally heterodox, but not necessarily the same exact origins, but still come to the same concept. And I was reminded of a book that John Dewey wrote, the name of which I have not been able to recall.
The Quest for Certainty?
What's that?
The Quest for Certainty?
No, it was one we didn't actually read at UMKC, and it was essentially a treatise on how social science should be done. And the argument he made, and the reason I found it very profound, was the preface he had given at the beginning of it. He wrote this in the late teens, maybe 1919 or so, and then wrote a new preface for it right towards the end of his life, which put it around the late 40s. The argument he had made in the late teens had been that we had made substantial advances in the natural sciences, which had led to improvements in technology, one could say. But what had lagged behind was our ability to apply reasoning, apply intelligence to organization. So the kind of profundity of the timing of that later preface was in the late 40s. He was looking back on the technological advance of the atomic bomb, right? And he had suggested that our technology had outstripped our ability to organize it in a way that was good for society, right? So Sebastian had mentioned that there's a need to bring science and technology under democratic control, right? This is a common theme throughout this. And I just wanted to say, the reason I like this concept of social costs is, and we spoke to this earlier, is that what we're doing here by identifying social costs as social scientists is we're bringing values and ethics into social science, right? So through this, where we can not only, we're not just bringing science under democratic control, we're making science itself ethical, and I think this is a key goal of not just economics but social science in general, and I think that the social cost concept moves us towards that direction. It gives us kind of a unifying rubric, maybe. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay, and I would like actually to hear some perspective from South Asian point of view, if you have, Sirisha, to say about either the concept or any issue that is related to social cost.
Well, I was going to actually bring in some Marxist perspective, or maybe not in terms of social cost. But, how can we use social cost and what does it mean? So one of the things that Bob mentioned was, that labor would, if wages were not sufficient, labor would find other ways of trying to, have a subsistence, right? However we define that subsistence, through time and space. And, so you could have charities and you could have public, transfers and public charities, etc. But one of the issues that, I've been thinking about is this issue of social reproduction as it relates to South Asia. And if you think about sort of the notion of the reserve army of labor, so the question is, why would, if you have a society where the balance of power is tilted and tilted against labor, one reason why you would want labor to have some kind of subsistence wage is because you need labor, because it's important, because it's, in this very, like Bob said, it's a factor of production and you sort of abstract it, but it's needed, right? But if you begin to have significant, an oversupply, to use this sort of mainstream term, but also if you were to think about the reserve army of labor, but sort of labor that's more than sufficient to keep wages down. So in effect, they become, superfluous, right? So, how then does one have, I think perhaps, if you bring in this ethical issue of social cost, maybe that is one way of saying, well, labor is not just a, factor, input into production. There's an ethical aspect associated with it, and maybe that's one way of putting it. So I think in that sense it's sort of useful. But I think also to think about the fact that it might not be sort of, a natural aspect, or it might not be as, so for instance, if you think about, the slums in India, or the slums in Bangladesh, or the slums in, all over the world. Maybe if they're superfluous, I don't really care if if they reproduce or not. Because already, as capital, whether productive or financial capital, that requires some level of production so that I can satisfy my consumption needs. Maybe it's not sufficient. So perhaps maybe this ethical aspect could play a role, but maybe that's something that I thought was maybe we can discuss.
So not to view labor just as an input of production, but as people that that are not disposable.
Exactly.
Because they are disposable if they are not a labor or input in production.
Right. And sort of related to that, I think, we have to be very, very wary of some of the sort of, free market environmental instruments that are being propagated now, because I think that further reduces the ability of labor to actually subsist. So, and this is because you said South Asia, one of the ways that people, whether they're, part of the whole labor pool or, they're part of the, the proletariat or not, one way that they can subsist is by resorting to consumption through the environment. So as you begin to have these kinds of, free market and environmental, instruments, I think it's very problematic. So I don't think that you can, I think labor and environment are very, very, connected. And so.
Could I
Of course.
on that? One recent Nobel laureate, I'm not sure if that's the most recent, but Eleanor Alstrom, the political scientist at Indiana, I believe. That's where she spent her career, University of Indiana. Her whole life's work is about the commons and institutions for managing the commons. And of course that's distinguished from an open access or an open pool resource like the ocean. If you don't have any restrictions, anybody can go out and fish, anybody can go out and do anything. And Ostrom and Dan Bromley, Wisconsin, and other people have contributed a lot to investigating how people, where there isn't complete private ownership, how people in different cultures, and some of it I know there's a common well management in parts of India where a whole group of people who live in a valley basically all own the wells, and they all contribute to maintain the irrigation system. So I think you need something to you need some kind of property rights, but they don't have to be private property rights. But I guess I'm enough of a neoclass, no, I'm not enough of a neoclass, but I have enough sympathy for the idea that property rights, that you need some kind of something so people will behave responsibly vis-a-vis the resources. And if it's open access, that isn't going to happen. So if it's not open access, then you're either going to have a market type thing where you establish private property rights, or you're going to have some kind of common property institutions. And I'm all for that, but I don't know how many initiatives have been taken. I know the people who have studied it, mostly they've gone in somewhere and found these common property institutions and studied them and, you know, written about them and try to tell us how they work. But I don't know that any NGOs, for example, are in the business of promoting.
Maybe Sirisha can
Okay, so this is my dissertation topic.
Oh, okay, good.
So Wells, I looked at forests. So one of the problems with Ostrom and Brownlee and all of those people is that because they don't historicize, so you know there are criticisms against them for being very ahistorical and to some degree apolitical as well. But yes, I think they've done a lot of work in terms of looking at the commons. But one of the problems with looking at common property and the notion of property is that property means that you have to exclude, which means, and even though from I think sometimes in the US we think about the community as some kind of progressive institution. The community can be as sort of oppressive and as exclusionary as private entities can be. And so, that does not preclude conflict. So I think you might, you need those democratic institutions in place before we begin to, or not before, I mean, they don't have to be, it's not a stepwise kind of thing, but you would need those, and you cannot have, an equitable distribution of access to, nature or environment unless you have those democratic institutions, and you don't always have them. So that's sort of the problem with that literature is that, and I think people have sort of recognized it and been working with it in terms of the fact that community itself is not a panacea. And in India, there is a lot of resistance by communities of officially initiated, by the government and NGOs. It's big business. This is why I talked about, I asked you that question about NGOs. NGOs are big business in third world countries, and they're not always, I don't think they work in positive ways.
They don't always facilitate democracy
or development, or any of that stuff. Yeah, and so. Communities have been resisting what, theoretically they should be in favor of, because it's such a flawed concept. And they could, both the state as, the state which is, allied with private interests, continues to hold control over community common property, even though there's some noises made about.
Sebastian?
Yeah, thanks. I've been thinking for a long time about what happened since the 60s, right? Because it seems like this way, so we're talking about social cost as an idea today, it seems like that the left sort of lost the battle over ideas since the 60s and 70s. And I'm wondering if we talk about an idea today, in how far this idea of social cost as theory can do anything for us in our perspective, this heterodox perspective, to reopen this battle. I mean, Randy talks about how the financial system underwent the transformation, but that also was fueled by ideas, as he correctly pointed out. And these ideas came out of the 60s, 70s, they were promoted. Then 10 years later, they made it into politics. Politicians acted based on these ideas. So economists and their ideas have a vital role to play in how society is transformed. I'm not sure what's the causation, whether the material structure brings these economists about and then they influence the material structure again, or whether the primary mover are actually the ideas to some extent. And my question would simply be, if we talk about ideas today, what has the left in economics not done right that we gave up this position of hegemony that we had coming out of the New Deal era? Really in the university system, etc., we had the position of hegemony. What did we do wrong that we lost this position to the neoliberals and their ideas? And obviously they have different financial resources and so on, that matters too, but what, if anything, can we do and strategies devise, and perhaps surrounding this concept of social costs, to take back the power to some extent? And Randy talked about the blogs, the blogosphere being a very important tool nowadays to promote some of these ideas, that some new element in what ideas and how ideas can be transmitted and become powerful that didn't exist yet. Because I'm thinking, are we just talking about this heterodox theory now and it's not going to go anywhere? Or what would we have to do to reverse it, to reverse this transformation, to undo the damage that was done by the neoliberal thought collective that really reversed the way we think about almost everything economic as a society? And they reversed that within 30 or 40 years fundamentally. And they got the media in the boat, they got all the politicians in the boat, they control a lot of think tanks. Of course, they have money for it to do it. All of the sociology of economics work has been done by Mirowski in the last 4 or 5 years, which is great work. I encourage everybody to read that stuff, including where the money comes from. It's very interesting. But what can we do to contribute to reversing that, unless we want to say, oh, it's all doomed, we're never going to win the battle of ideas anymore against the neoliberal thought collective. So, and my hope would be maybe that the social costs idea can contribute a little bit to taking back the power or the realm of discourse. I just want to put that out there. I'm not sure if anybody else is interested in sociology of knowledge, but maybe somebody wants to comment on that.
Okay, I guess I can brave out a little bit of here or something. I mean, I agree with the spirit of your question, I do. But it isn't so much, what, the left did in the academy. I mean, maybe they made a few mistakes here and there, but I mean, you mentioned passingly, the Mirowski books and others, and I'm sure you're aware of all these things, but I mean, I think, didn't the University of Illinois fire its entire department at one point? University of Texas has had prominent purges from time to time. There was a very aggressive hand in there that, made simply being a part of the academy complicated in a lot of different ways. And I think one of the reasons is because if you look at like political science, law, and economics, these tend to be what I call kind of power disciplines. For whatever reasons, most misguided, discourse coming from an economist, lawyer, or political science has a trump to it that is different. I'm thinking about a face on CNN or something, than having somebody from American history or something like that. They just listen in a different way, they respond in a different way. And as a result, I think there's also, you rarely hear about mass purges of the literature department or something like that for that reason. In fact, in a way, it's almost functional to have Marxists in your literature department. The college can get a reputation for being open-minded, and at the same time, it doesn't really disrupt the production process in any important way. Not to be mean, but that's, I think, the case. So I think a lot of that is there, and I'm not quite sure how simple it is to reverse that kind of thing. I mean, there have been efforts, right? The founding of the New School for Social Research and things like that to try to create counter institutions, but it's very hard to hold on and sustain those things over time. It's all the pressures are usually to push you into the fold in some way. The thing about UC Santa Cruz was founded without grades, for example, and 10 or 12 years ago they gave up on that, right? There's just this incredible pressure to become homogenous again and kind of, well, we're not like the other schools. And that's usually defined as a problem for most people. Why aren't you like the other schools, and so on. On that said, I mean, I'm quite agreeing with you on the social cost phrase. I would also say, coming back to the labor thing, the idea of like, a day's work for a day's wage if you turn that into an opinion poll, some unbelievable number of Americans would sign off on that as just a phrase. And I think they really believe it. You know, I mean, something like 88% or so. And keeping in mind, like 4 or 5% of Americans think Elvis is still alive. So you're getting to be pretty darn close to everyone who's sane thinks a day's work should have a day's wage. But of course, you know, as Sarisha was implying, I mean, it has a lot of radical potential in it, right? The idea that actually everybody's going to get paid. And, you know, and Randy's developed some of this stuff with his ELR, and I think correctly, I do this just to try to shake up my own students a little bit. But, you know, in the late 90s, the Burlington unemployment rate got down to 1%. And I just to give them a little description of what that meant for the town of Burlington. And my kids are all shocked. Of course, they've never experienced low unemployment and what that might mean. But, you know, so 98, 99, McDonald's was hiring at like $14 an hour to start with benefits. But that's the kind of stuff that happens when you have 1% unemployment, right? I mean, things really begin to change in a really dramatic way, often for the good. When I do economic history, I point out, you know, the huge migrations of black people out of the South where they actually could get, you know, decent jobs in the big cities of the West Coast and so on. I don't think it's completely surprising that second wave feminism came up in the 60s and 70s during very low unemployment periods and so forth. Now, these things are connected, which isn't to say taking out activists and making them unimportant, but it creates a structure that allows people to get leverage, to take risks that aren't completely penalizing one. I mean, I think about the student movement in the 60s, which again, I admire the energy and so forth, but everybody was like, you stub out your reefer and cut your hair and you had a job. I mean, it's 2% unemployment by 68 or 69. So, you know, the risks people were taking then were risks, but they weren't the same kind of risks that our students might take today with 10 or 12% unemployment. So I think that's some real stuff. So days work for days wage, the social cost, you know, an analog to that I didn't discuss because I was working on labor today, but the shifting of risk, which is really what's captured in Randy's story, although to the extent it's fraud, it's not risk at all. Bill Black, I can hear him saying that to me right now. There's no risk here, you know, but let's call it that anyway. But the point is, if I can create a risk and get you to bear it, that's got to be a good deal for me. I mean, you know, why wouldn't I do that? I might even do it for fun. I mean, just because, you know, I could be, you know, that kind of person. Also, coming back a little bit on the environment stuff, I don't know if you guys have seen this book by Lisa Park called The Slums of Aspen. But Shrisha, your comments kind of provoked that a little bit. You're talking about community organizing and how that may work in perverse ways. And it's a fantastic little book. This person came by Middlebury and gave a talk, but it's more or less how the good people of Aspen, who, you know, have about 18 times my annual income, got together to use environmental laws to essentially harass and penalize all the Mexican migrants who do all the work in town. And it's just a really nasty little book, but it also kind of makes you laugh in a way because it's just, you know, kind of a naked kind of abuse that's just amazing. And, you know, the way the writer captures it, it was just like incredible. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of, you know, these good words like, you know, labor, environment, community can be mixed and matched in certain ways that get really scary, you know, when they're handled wrong. And I know you're aware of that in India and so on, but I was thinking here in the U.S. too, it's not just an India story. And I know you know that too. I'm just throwing that book out there as something if people want to find a nice afternoon. It's a very readable book. It's not very long. Oh, it's called The Slums of Aspen by Lisa Park.
Nice. Three quick things. So a partial answer. What did the left do wrong is much too big. I can't possibly deal with that. But I think that the main policy failures in the U.S. and also in Euroland is that policymakers and economists, including left economists, don't understand money. They don't understand how the government spends. They don't understand the fact that a sovereign government spends by crediting bank accounts. Okay, so, but let me give you an example of where the left got it completely wrong because they don't understand this. Social Security. So Social Security has been under attack since it was created in the 30s. Okay, the right wing hates it. They want to get rid of it, and with the rise of money manager capitalism, there became another reason to do it, so it wasn't just purely for ideological reasons. Money managers wanted that money to manage. So they wanted to destroy Social Security. So Greenspan was appointed by Reagan to have this Social Security Commission, how to reform it, how to put it on sound finance. And what he did is he raised payroll taxes, okay? And that helped to reduce support for the program, especially among the young. And then there was a well-financed campaign to tell the young people, forget it, you're never going to collect Social Security, it's going to go broke, you're never going to get it. And so they were able to increase hostility by yet another group against the program. So what does the left do? When Al Gore ran for presidency, he decided to make Social Security a campaign issue, and what he said was, let's go ahead and agree with the right wing that Social Security is on a path to bankruptcy. Because then the progressives can propose a solution to resolve that problem. And his solution was the lockboxes. And people remember the campaign, and basically it was his only campaign issue. It was pure nonsense, and nobody could understand what on earth he was talking about. So of course he lost the election. But the left has, you know, just so attached to the payroll tax and increasing taxes and removing the base so that we tax all the income above 107,000 or whatever, which creates even more enemies of the program, higher income people who realize that Social Security is a very bad deal for them, okay? Somewhat debatable, it's not quite as bad as they think, but it's not a very good deal for people who are high income, okay? And so they've tied the fortunes of Social Security to these measures of its financial sustainability. But it's all nonsense. Social Security is a federal government program. It cannot go bankrupt. There's no reason to keep a separate balance sheet for Social Security. The government spends by crediting bank accounts, keystrokes. It can never run out of these things. Any problems with Social Security have nothing to do with the finance. We're an aging society. What does that mean? More resources for aged people now and into the future. Let's deal with that. We got to move resources to take care of elderly people. We don't need to raise payroll taxes or tax the rich, soak the rich, or anything like that. We need to build old folks' homes. That's the solution. So it has nothing to do with this. But, and I can tell you that people at EPI, Economic Policy Institute, which is the main progressive think tank we have in the United States, they absolutely understand every word I just said, but they will never say it in public. Because they are so attached to the payroll tax and raising taxes on the rich that they will lie to the public and say Social Security is running out of money, even though they know it's false. So this is an example. It's giving in for what they see as a political strategy rather than telling the truth. Anyway, so that is just a partial response. I did want to say two things. One on the reserve army of the unemployed and superfluous workers. Yeah, all of this is absolutely right, and I agree. We need to take the ethical aspect. Okay, so what is the argument for the reserve army of the unemployed? That they help to keep down inflation pressures, okay, so that wages are not bid up by labor markets that are too tight. Is this ethical? Of course it's not ethical. It's not ethical to force 10% of your population to be unemployed to be inflation fighters, because unemployment is always concentrated. Any society you go to, it takes you about a half hour to figure out which group is going to have the high unemployment. Okay? In the United States, it's African Americans. Okay? This is not ethical to say you must be unemployed in order to keep inflation down. So this is even if you believe the Phillips curve. Okay? So we have to find another strategy to fight unemployment. I mean, to fight inflation. We can't use unemployment. Okay? And the second thing is it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because employers don't see them as good substitutes. Once you've been unemployed for 6 months, you're not holding down wages because the employers are not going to hire you anyway. Where do you end up? In prison. And once you've gone to prison, you're not employable when you get out. So it doesn't work either. So it's not ethical and it doesn't work. So what's the alternative? You have to have an employed reserve army, not an unemployed reserve army. Okay, and that's ELR, Employer of Last Resort or Job Guarantee. And the final thing is on innovations. It sounds really nice, right? We like innovations. Innovations are good inherently. But in the financial sector, innovations are almost always bad. Almost always against the public interest. Because there really are only three reasons for innovations. One is to dupe your customers. And that pretty much covers most of the innovations of the past 15 years. It's to dupe the customers, okay? The second reason is to get around regulations. Okay? Well, that has to be against the public interest, okay? They innovate. As soon as a regulation is passed, the financial sector tries to find a way to get around it. Well, that's against the public interest, okay? And the third is to shift risks, but that also is almost always a bad idea because, look, financial institutions are supposed to be risk assessors. They will only do good underwriting if they hold the risks. If they can shift them, why should they care whether you're creditworthy? So again, it's a bad idea to permit innovation. So what do? Well, the idea of CAP, that they must be pre-approved. So no financial innovation should ever be allowed until it's been approved by something like an FDA, that approves drugs. And you can think of financial innovations are like viruses. Okay? They're just like a virus. They spread around the world. What you want to do is you want to isolate those things and contain them so that they don't get out. And they've got to be approved before they can get out and infect the whole world and bring down the whole global financial system again.
Okay, I think one of the things that's really important is the language that we choose for this. And I think, one of the problems with social cost is that, is that it's sort of, co-opted is probably not the right way of phrasing that, but because it's claimed in a sense by neoclassicals, you have that whole, all of the problems that Sebastian talked about in the beginning. And I had never heard of cost shifting until I came to Wright State. But that, I think, is a much more powerful term because, again, of all the reasons that Sebastian talked about in terms of, the whole idea of externalities, I used to, back when I used to teach supply and demand, and I'd say to my students, okay, so we've got this whole market here, and who can think of a good that doesn't involve externalities? And nobody ever could think of one. There is nothing you could think of. Now, what that means, by the way, is that when you look at the neoliberal policies to clean up countries with serious balance of payments problems, that they need to get prices right. Well, one of the things that we basically know is that prices are not right anywhere, ever, And so I like to explain the structural adjustment to my students by saying, okay, we're going to get prices right. Prices are going to switch, tomorrow to be right. And based on something Swaney told me, I said, okay, gasoline should cost about $10 a gallon. Okay, that probably is, 10, 15 years out of date, that notion. But so it should cost $10 a gallon. So you wake up tomorrow morning, and gasoline is now $10 a gallon. Now, that's going to force you to support the idea of public transportation. It might cause you, over the long run, to reorder where you're going to live. But all of that is going to take a long time, and in the meantime, you're spending $10 a gallon to get around. The other thing that I wanted to say in terms of sort of emphasizing those things is I want to add another dimension of social cost. And this is important because the whole notion of how we talk about cost, the idea of labor as a cost that I as a firm need to lower because we're trying to minimize costs, so we need to get rid of labor and shed labor because that's a cost. Well, the example from the work that I've done includes the idea during transition, during economic transition from socialism to capitalism, especially in Germany, where they set up East Germany, where they set up a set of holding companies to sort of manage this. And they said, you know, one of the big problems that all these firms have is that they pay all this stuff for their employees like they pay for childcare. And that's just not a cost that you can bear. Well, if you're thinking about the society as a whole, what are we talking about doing? What you're saying is that this firm needs to shift that cost that they've been paying for under socialism to somebody else. It doesn't mean we're going to kill off all the children so that we no longer have to pay for childcare. It doesn't mean that. And so we need to start thinking about sort of what cost means. And this is sort of kind of like the entropy thing. You know, you're moving these people around. And you're not saving anything simply by paying your workers less to do the same job. That is not an efficiency improvement. It's paying your workers less to do the same job. So,
and I think related to that perhaps is the question of redistribution. The day when we speak about redistribution, we imagine, okay, the government is sending transfer checks to somebody, taking our taxes and so on. But redistribution is going the whole time within the private sector. I mean, what we described as the financial crisis was a redistribution, stripping of equity. So I just redefining or thinking about redistribution, which basically gets to this question of rethinking what cost is the one major hurdle to talk about redistribution that takes place on part of corporations from households and labor.
Could I just say, though,
Yes.
in terms of framing for the public, the word redistribution is terrible framing. Absolutely terrible.
Correct.
Okay, so the way you frame it is, we have people who are too poor. They need more income. Let's give them more income. We have people who are too rich. They need to have less income. Let's take some away. Don't talk about redistribution, because now you've linked the two. The way we will help the poor is by taking from the rich. That's never going to make it.
Redistribution as a description of what happened in the financial crisis is
because we get to the point is we
good argument.
But see, most people say it wasn't the policy. We might all agree actually that was the policy, but most people don't see that the government had undertaken that as a policy. But when we're talking about redistribution by the government to help the poor, then the problem is we've linked helping the poor to taking from the rich, and that's not
and that's why this
possible
term
in
is
America.
wrong.
What?
That's what I was pointing out, that term basically is
Okay,
wrong
good.
in
I agree.
misleading.
I agree.
So in terms of redistribution, though, I mean, I think part of the problem is sort of part of what, you know, talking about wages. I mean, wages should be sufficient to cover at least, you know, your basic needs. You know, I'm not even talking about, you know, the distribution, you know, you know, how surpluses are, you know, distributed, but and so, you know, apart, not just talking about, you know, we need to give money to the poor, you know, and that's part of the ex ante, ex post issue that Sebastian had talked before, right? I mean, so if we think that, you know, if we decide that, you know, education is important, then, you know, primary education is free, right? So it's an ex ante policy, and I think in terms of at least sort of subsistence, that should not be something that's necessarily, you know, that people have to depend on charity or transfers. It should be something, I mean, if I'm working, I should get, well, I should get all, you know, all of, you know, the full value, but at least sufficient to, you know, cover my basic needs. So, you know, that's...
Call it a living wage, though.
A living wage.
Again, the framing of subsistence is better.
Right.
Going back to classical political economy, but with a new definition of wage subsistence or living wage. Okay, I think we are almost out of time. Is it 5:30 already?
No, it's 5:45.
Okay, we are out of time officially.
Thank you for your attendance, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And we are going to try to post on the workshop website the video, and also there is other material. Thank you to the presenters and participants.